Now, before we go on to getting these tests passed, I think there's a few things to acknowledge here. First is that we have this ratemysetup.app@gmail.com, which is our from address, and that should pretty much be the same address for every single email. And that should never change. That shouldn't be something that we're configuring on the fly, and so that probably belongs in config. Another thing to note here is that if we look at our password reset strategy, we want to redirect the user to a front-end URL that contains the token correctly, right? And so we maybe want to implement a method to do that as well. So let's actually throw in a new little test in here. Let's just say two things. Let's first test that a construct password reset URL creates the correct password reset URL. And it'll be a simple method. This is probably a silly test to do, but just to illustrate what we're going to be doing here, we are going to create a token, or we're going to get a token, ABC123, and then we're going to create a URL from email service dot construct password reset URL method. And we're going to pass it the token, and we should expect that URL to equal http://localhost 3000 /password reset token equals the token. Now, another thing to note here is that this right here, this localhost 3000, that probably should not be hard coded in there, because what about when we deploy this to production? We don't want to only send the user to localhost 3000. We want to send them to whatever the production client URL is. And so that should probably also live in config. And again, this system of using or creating this URL here with this question mark token equals token, this whole query parameter or URL search parameter syntax is it's one of those things that is similar to parameters that we've seen before, like path parameters, but it operates a little bit differently in that this password reset URL here doesn't change ever. If we pass in no URL search parameters, it'll still work just the same. You can add as many of these as one. You can say token equals token, and name equals name, and friends equal friends. And so you can pass as many of these URL search parameters here as you want. But for the time being, we're only passing a single one, which probably tells you that maybe we don't need to be using query parameters here, but it's a good opportunity to show how they work in Node and on the React side. So we're going to be leveraging them for this, and they actually work perfectly in this situation. So it's not a bad thing to do, but just note that there are other ways to accomplish this with different approaches. But having done that, let's go ahead and update our config a little bit to set up we want to make sure that we have addressed some of our duplication here and config variables in our actual config itself. And so actually go into the config.js file here, and let's add a few things. First, let's actually name our application. Let's say const application name is equal to rate my setup, just like that. And then let's go in here and let's also create a client URL. Let us set it equal to process.env.client URL or http://localhost 3000. Let's do one more thing. Let's add a const email from address. Set that equal to process.env.email from address, just so that that's part of config as well. Then let's make sure we are actually using those variables here. Let's take application name and let's throw it in our config here. So instead of saying advanced rate my setup config, let's say application name config, like that. So that if we ever decide to change this name, it'll be relatively easy, straightforward. And then let's also, below is testing, let's create one for client URL, just so that we can establish that we have our client URL set up. And we want to make sure that we have our email from address in here as well. So we'll say email from address, like so. And then we want to make sure we export all of those as well. So we want to export the email from address, the application name, and the client URL. And in doing so, we can then go ahead and actually use these across our application. First, we'll go ahead and go into the .env file and add a client URL is equal to HTTP localhost 3000 for the time being. And let's go ahead and add it to the .env template file as well. And then let's also add a email from address, which I'm going to set to ratemysetup.app@gmail.com. And I'm going to come in here into the .env template and do the same thing, but I'm just going to say email@gmail. Something like that, so that we know to change it later on. And since we'll be passing all of these values to our email service, let's go ahead and update our email service a bit, since we want to actually use all of these environment variables in our email service. So go into the email service, and actually let's go into the index.js so we can see how we're going to be using that here. We're not just going to be importing the SendGrid API key and the email service active. We're also going to be sending in the client URL and the email from address and the application name. And we want to pass all of these here as the client URL, as the email from address, and as the application name. And so now that we have set these all up in config, we can actually do the same thing in our test file. Come in here, we can replace all of this with the proper config imports. And let's go ahead and also instantiate the default email service and the rest of the email services the same way. So we'll place this like so. We'll place this like so, but setting is active to true. We'll replace this like so, but setting is active to true. Just across the board. We're making some updates here just so that our tests use the proper configuration. Just like that. Oops. And having done that, we can then go into our actual email service itself and expect a few more config variables here. We can expect the client URL, the email from address, and the application name. Now, why are we going through all of this trouble to do that? Well, we're going to actually use them when we construct all of the different emails objects, because we want to be able to use the same email from address, the same client URL, and the same application name in every single email we send. And so doing that, we can come down here to say the send password reset email, and let's see how that might work. We'll say const email is equal to, oh yeah, it should accept a user, right? And actually it should also accept a token, correct? User and a token here? Yeah, because we're gonna need that token. We'll say const to, and we'll set that equal to user.email, and we'll say from this.email from address, so we can standardize that process. The subject will be reset your password for, and we'll pass in this application name. And then let's create some HTML here that is just a string that has, let's just do the standard HTML. I don't even know if you actually need this in the email, but let's do it anyway. Let's add a body, and let's make sure there's an H1. This is a lot more difficult than writing regular JSX because it doesn't do any of the completion for you, but it's okay. It's nice to get used to it. And then we'll use some break tags instead of styling, and we'll say you are receiving this email because you made a request to reset the password for your account. Cool. And let's create another break tag there, and then let's say click on the link below to finish the password reset process. Cool. Then let's create the link here, and let's set it equal to, oh, you know what? We need to create that link, don't we? We'll say const reset password URL is equal to this.construct password reset URL with the token. And then let's actually create that here. Say const, we don't actually need to do const, excuse me. And it should take in a token. And it should create that URL by simply returning this.client URL / password reset, and then the query parameter equal to the token, just so that we standardize that process as well. Now we can go ahead and finish this by passing in this reset password URL here and adding it here as well. Let's just make sure the link is both displayed, the actual text itself, and it's a link that if they just click on it, it'll work. Because you never know where things could go wrong there. So at least providing the text is a nice little fallback. And if you did not make this request, contact support immediately, because there's a problem. And then let's go ahead and return await this dot send email with the email. Now we save this and let's go ahead and run those tests again and see if it's working. Okay, I think it's still failing. Let's see. Send password reset email. Okay. Subject is, I think I messed up the subject there. From is undefined. This dot email from address. Email from address, email from address. Did we not save the config? Looks like we did. Maybe it just hasn't reset it to the .env file, or email from address. Okay, that looks good. Let's see. Let's actually run npm start and see what's up. Npm start. Okay, do I see email from address here? I do. ratemysetup@gmail.com. Great. Let's go into the email service. It says this.email from address is equal to email from address. And hopefully we are setting it up correctly here. Email from, oh, I spelled address wrong. Okay, cool. Well, that's an easy fix. Let's go email from address. Let's just copy that and let's fix all of these. Should be double D's there. Excuse me. Should be ADD or S. So sometimes nice little typos like that. Test will catch that for you and it saves you years of debugging, which is super nice. And now let's run that test again and hope it works. Okay, great. Only one pass, only one failing, which is exactly what we want. And the main reason it's failing, in this case, construct, okay, is because that subject does not exist and it's a different one. Okay, let's go in here and let's do a few things. Okay, cool. Send password reset email. That looks good. And let's head into the service itself and let's update this send password confirmation email. And that's actually, it's pretty much gonna be the same thing, right? We're just sending an email like this, except this time it's not gonna say reset your password for, it's gonna say your password has been reset successfully, period. And then we'll say password reset notification, and we'll come in here and say this is a confirmation of a successful password reset for your account. And then we'll get rid of all this. If you did not reset your password, contact support immediately. We'll save that as well. Come in here, we'll run it, and hopefully we should have everything passing. We don't. Let's see why. It's the same thing. Okay, it's expecting this from subject is reset your password for rate my setup is what's there, is what's received, and instead, okay, interesting. Let's see what I did wrong here. There you go. Wrong method. Let's use this one. Cool. Now let's try it again. Okay, still failing. Let's see why. User is not defined. They're not. You sure about that? To user.email. Okay. Oh, is that in the actual async? Ah, it's in here. Okay. Ah, we are not passing in the user. Good to know. Let's paste that in. Try it one more time. Haha! And we are passing. And so at this point, we have now a fully functional email service set up, implemented, used across our application, and we should be ready to handle everything on the front end. So let's go ahead and git status git add, git commit, mocked email service in tests, and added configuration to get password reset email service working. Great. Time to move on to the front end.